Okay, so now we're going to talk about special parallelograms. And all the special parallelograms have all the characteristics of a parallelogram. So all the ones we talked about before, which include opposite sides are congruent, opposite sides are parallel, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, and diagonals bisect each other. So everything we're going to talk about after that has all of these characteristics plus some. So then we want to figure out what makes the special parallelograms special. What makes them differ from just being a parallelogram? Okay. So first of all, we're going to talk about rectangles and what makes rectangles special and not just a parallelogram. Okay. So first of all, rectangles have four right angles and they also have diagonals that are congruent. So remember before we said the diagonals bisected each other, but they didn't have to be congruent in parallelograms. But in a rectangle, they bisect each other and they're congruent. All right, so over here with the four right angles, if we're gonna make our fourth point, well, we know they got to be equal distance, and the sides are still opposite sides are still congruent and parallel. So this will be our fourth point, and then we can connect them to make our rectangle. And so if we want the property that they all have four right angles, then we know here, and the box is a symbol for four right angles. Now, so if we want to know the diagonals are congruent to each other, well, we know this space between these 2 points has to be the same distance as the other 2 points, and so we can make them match up. And then let's go ahead and draw our shape to make our rectangle. And then so here are diagonals, and they are all congruent to each other. So they're congruent to each other and they bisect each other. Okay? And so that's what makes rectangles differ from just being a parallelogram. So yes, they have all the properties of a parallelogram, but they also have these two which make them special. All right, so let's talk about a rhombus. What makes a rhombus special? Well, first of all, they have four congruent sides. So then if we were to finish this one, make four congruent sides, we would make sure that this point would be here to make them congruent. And you can get that by kind of counting the slope between the 2 points. So I went from this, if I made slope, I went up to, right, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I can kind of do the same thing from here, go up to, right, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's how I was able to get the other point. So then we have four congruent sides, which would mean this side is congruent to this side, congruent to this side, congruent to this side. And we could check that by actually using the distance formula or using Pythagorean theorem and checking the length of all the sides. Next, we know that the diagonals are perpendicular to each other. So not only do the diagonals bisect each other, but where they intersect, they make right angles, which is why they're perpendicular. So here we have, in this case, we have 2 points. So we're just going to fill in to make our other 2 points to make our rhombus. Okay, and so where our diagonals intersect, they make a right angle. Okay, and that's what perpendicular means. They also bisect each other, and that's just from being a parallelogram. So this one is congruent to this one. This half is congruent to this half. But as hopefully you can see, those diagonals don't have to be congruent. They just have to be perpendicular to each other. And the last one that makes a rhombus special is the diagonals bisect opposite angles. So we wanted to finish this from these 2 points. Now these would be our points here because we know our diagonals need to be perpendicular. And so then we can just connect to finish making our rhombus. Okay. And what we're saying is the diagonals actually bisect opposite angles. So that means these two are congruent because the diagonal bisected that angle. And here, those are congruent, as well as the other bisects these opposite angles. Okay? Which is different than just a parallelogram where the diagonals bisect each other, but they don't necessarily have to bisect the opposite angles, but in a rhombus they do. And then let's talk about a square. A square has all the properties of a parallelogram, rectangle, and rhombus. So you just put everything together. Opposite sides are congruent or parallel. Opposite angles are congruent. Consecutive angles are supplementary. Diagonals bisect each other. They also have 4 right angles and the diagonals are congruent. They have 4 congruent sides. The diagonals are perpendicular and the diagonals bisect opposite angles. So if we had to complete this one here, we have our points here, and then this makes our square. And then so we know all the sides are congruent, just like in a rhombus. You got 4 right angles, like in a rectangle. You have your diagonals, which are going to bisect each other, but the diagonals are also congruent, and they cross at a 90-degree angle. Okay? And so those are what make your special parallelograms special. And that's it.